The truth in the gospel may be suppressed for a time, but they will eventually and inevitably overcome.
500 years ago, a man was born who would change the face of Scotland forever. He defied the authorities. He defined a generation. He defeated a religion, and he brought a country to its knees. His name was John Knox, and this is his story.
Europe is a boil ready to burst. The Catholic Church has grown more and more powerful. The Sistine Chapel has recently been finished, and the discovery of the Americas and Asia has energized a wave of religious expansion. But the clergy are corrupt, caring little for the souls of the people and making themselves fat on the wealth of the land. In 3 years, Martin Luther will nail his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, marking the start of a reformation that will blow Christendom apart from end to end. And here, on this street in Haddington, in the Scottish uplands, in the remotest corner of Europe, John Knox is born.
The sort of world in which Knox is born into is a very interesting one because he is part of Christendom, the idea of the whole of most of what we call Europe under the jurisdiction of the Pope in one major multinational corporation in modern terms.
Some of the bishops were more religiously minded, one would say, but the church was heavily dominated by careerist politicians, really.
People often went for decades without having proper, well-trained clergy catering to their spiritual needs.
The only access that people had to the Bible was in Latin, and the people had no Latin. So virtually the Bible was an unknown book to the people.
When Knox was a teenager, the winds of reform began to blow in Scotland. A young nobleman, Patrick Hamilton, returned from Lutheran Germany teaching the radical new message. But this was too much for the church. They had him arrested for heresy, tried, and without delay he was burnt at the stake.
Convert, heretic! Call upon Our Lady!
How long shall darkness overwhelm this realm?
She shall be, Regina! End not this life in heresy!
Oh, Jesus, receive my spirit.
He becomes the first martyr of Scottish descent for the Protestant cause.
Well, it certainly frightened people, but whether frightening people is a way of suppressing the spread of religion, true or false, is another matter.
It was here, in St Andrews, that Patrick Hamilton was killed, and it was to here also that John Knox came to study. It was said that the reek of Patrick Hamilton infected as many as it blew upon, and Knox was no exception.
In all likelihood, he was taught by John Mayer, an influential thinker and celebrated academic who had recently returned to his native Scotland. Mayer criticised the abuses of the church and was an outspoken champion of the rights of ordinary people against kings and popes. Perhaps here, under this teaching, Knox first began to think of the church as urgently needing reform.
Knox had probably been intended for the church and a clerical career from a very early age. He's not the eldest son of a merchant's family, so he's not going to inherit the business. And going into the church was the best way of getting a good education and what we would call social mobility.
Knox wasted no time in becoming a priest, not, it seems, from any religious conviction, but from a simple desire to quietly earn some money. But in the wider country, things were changing fast, and Knox would quickly find himself propelled to prominence. The King of Scotland suddenly died, and with his daughter still an infant, a power vacuum emerged at the centre of Scotland, and now three rivals struggled to dominate the country. Head of the Scottish Church, Cardinal Beaton, the widowed Queen, Mary of Guise, and the powerful Earl of Arran.
Until the newborn queen would come of age, Arran had himself appointed regent of Scotland.
The regent Arran was cautiously sympathetic to the Protestant views beginning to circulate in Scotland. He passed laws permitting the possession of the Bible in English. This was the sign that many had been looking for, and some Protestant exiles began to return to Scotland, hoping for a time of greater tolerance. Among them was a man who would change Knox's life forever.
George Wishart had been a schoolteacher, but as soon as he arrived in Scotland, he began to preach.
The main problem for Wishart and all the early reformers was the growth of superstition.
The Church of Rome is just riddled with all kinds of additional superstitions and traditions.
In their eyes, the Church was God, and the Pope, of course, came to represent God on earth. So being right with them was equal to being right with God.
So the desire was to get right back to the early Church, but especially the early Church as represented by the Bible.
That's exactly what they thought of themselves as doing, just paring back, stripping back, rediscovering Christianity.
Wishart is a fantastic preacher, and everywhere he goes, he draws large crowds. And Knox hears what this man has to say, and we could probably identify a real religious conversion.
I think this was the clearest teaching probably that Knox had heard.
An individual must have a personal relationship with God that's not mediated through saints or priests.
So in that way, the person is changed radically in his or her soul, so that now from hating God, they come to love God.
Knox is moved by Wishart's words and becomes his bodyguard.
Sometimes Knox was present with a two-handed sword to defend Wishart against attempts at assassination.
He has come out in a rather different sense from the modern one, but he has shown that he is a prominent supporter. So that means he is then a marked man.
Things may have become a little more tolerant in Scotland, but the Church could not ignore a popular preacher openly condemning so much of what it stood for. Wishart knew he was in danger. Knox's presence may deter an angry thug, but not a disciplined band. One evening, after preaching here in St. Mary's Kirk, Wishart took his friend and companion to one side and spoke to him forcefully, urging him to leave.
My place is with thee now more than ever. Nay, John. Return to thy bairns. One is sufficient for a sacrifice.
Reluctantly persuaded, Knox said his farewell, and Wishart continued on alone.
A few hours later, the soldiers arrived. Wishart was arrested, charged with heresy.
Protestantism is a challenge to the late medieval church, and one that, in this case, Cardinal Beaton feels he cannot ignore.
Greatly alarmed, the Regent Arran spoke directly to Cardinal Beaton, arguing for Wishart's release, but the churchman would not be persuaded. Wishart was tried, convicted, and burnt to death here on this spot in St. Andrews, now marked by his initials.
I don't think we can underestimate the impact that seeing someone burned publicly has on crowds, particularly individuals who know that person.
His preaching had been listened to by thousands of people in Scotland, and they saw that here was a man who ought never to have been put to death because he was a devout Christian man.
It has brought together disparate groups within Scotland.
They're coming together and they're praying for change. They want God to engage with Scotland and change the religious landscape.
It shook the nation to question what the Roman Catholic Church really was standing for.
The burning of Wishart angered many people, and some had no scruples in getting their revenge. Early one spring morning, a ruthless band of men secretly entered the Cardinal's castle. Beaton tried to barricade himself here in his room, but the men burst in on him and killed him without mercy.
I am a priest. You shall not slay me.
Repent thee of thy former wicked life.
I am a priest.
The murder of such an influential lord of church and nation was unheard of. and the shockwave reverberated around the country. Knowing they were now hunted men, the murderers chose to barricade themselves here in the castle. They saw themselves as the vanguard of a Protestant revolution, and more than 100 people flocked to join them in defending the castle.
The castle then became a focus for Protestantism. So I don't know that this was the purpose of the assassins when they set about their work, but that was the consequence of it.
Although the regent Aaron had been tolerant of Protestantism, he could not allow such a rebellion against the law and the state. Rallying the army, he laid siege to the castle. The rebels were completely cut off, except by sea.
However, they still held one trump card.
Aaron's young son had been in the castle at the time of Beaton's murder and was now a hostage. As long as he was sure that the boy was alive and well, Aaron would not risk a full assault on the castle. With no way to break the stalemate, a temporary truce was negotiated, and Aaron allowed free passage in and out of the castle.
This was the opportunity that Knox had been waiting for. Ever since Wishart's arrest, Knox had been on the run, sometimes just one step ahead of the authorities. The castle was now the safest place for him. Knox had not been living long at the castle before his sharp mind and blunt speech attracted the attention of the community. One Sunday, in the middle of the service, the chaplain shocked Knox by addressing him personally.
In the name of God, I charge thee that thou refusest not this holy vocation, but that thou takest upon thee the public office and charge of preaching.
As Knox looked around the congregation, he saw that he was the only one taken aback. Unanimously, the castle community were appointing him to preach. He ran from the church and burst into tears. It was a life-changing moment for John Knox. Protestant preachers in a Catholic country had a low life expectancy, and Knox had much soul-searching to do. Could he do this? Could he preach the truth without fear? Might he even face death for his faith, like his mentor before him? By the next Sunday, however, Knox had overcome his scruples.
Standing here in the parish pulpit, Knox delivered a sermon more critical of Catholicism than anything Wishart had ever preached. He even compared the Pope to the Antichrist, the final terrifying beast from the prophecy of Daniel.
After these things I beheld in the vision of the night, and lo, the fourth beast, fearful and wonderful and full strong, and it had great iron teeth, and defiled with his feet.
But the core of Knox's preaching was not something negative, but something positive. He truly believed that the gospel was and is good news.
The most essential thing in the gospel have been radically changed, altered, and destroyed, and that was the way whereby a sinful person can have peace with God.
The gospel is good news because at the moment we're experiencing bad news. The bad news is that we are not reconciled to God. We have broken his commandments, and we are infected essentially with a virus of sin. That's the human condition. To be delivered from it, we need salvation.
The Bible tells us that Christ ultimately has to bridge the gap between humanity and God. God saves human beings rather than human beings saving themselves.
It's absolutely impossible to deserve to get to heaven. The only way to get to heaven is by faith alone in Jesus Christ, whose blood cleanses us from sin.
Knox did not have the freedom to preach in the castle for long. Holding the regent's son as hostage had deterred Aaron's attack, but was to have far less impact on Mary of Guise. She secretly made an agreement with Catholic France, and suddenly 21 French galleys were sailing into the bay, bombarding the castle. The castle community were outmanned and outgunned. When the French troops breached the wall, Knox and his comrades had no choice but to surrender. Knox now entered the most dismal part of his life. Enslaved and chained to a rowing bench in a French galley, Knox was kept in harsh, insanitary conditions for almost 2 years. Disease was continually present among the 300 men all crammed together, and Knox's health collapsed. But eventually he recovered, and a short time after we find that he is free. Was he released? Did he escape? We don't know. But we do know that instead of staying in Catholic France or returning to Catholic Scotland, Knox chose to move here, to Protestant England.
Although the Reformation was formally established in England, there were a lot of people who were not sympathetic among the people, the common people.
There's also a group within the Church of England who wish to keep pushing on with Protestant reform. The Archbishop of Canterbury in the reign of Edward VI is Thomas Cranmer, who was helping the Church of England to move in a more Protestant direction.
Knox was very much on that reformed side in the English Church, and he certainly was a respected member of it.
Knox has a rather odd position within the Church of England because he isn't actually a normal cleric, but he is used initially as an army chaplain.
Without delay, Knox was sent to Berwick-upon-Tweed, a garrison town with a large contingent of rowdy, quarrelsome soldiers, famous for their violence and disorder.
Knox knew it would not be an easy charge, but he records that by the time he left, Berwick was a changed place, peaceful and God-fearing. This church is the direct replacement of the medieval Church of the Holy Trinity where Knox ministered. And in fact, this is the actual pulpit that Knox would have preached from.
O God, hast thou laid none other burden on our backs than Jesus Christ laid in his law? Then who hath burdened us with all these ceremonies? The devil, brethren.
As crowds gathered to hear him, news of this firebrand reached the ears of the bishop. When forced to make a choice, Bishop Tunstall had decided to accept a separation from Rome rather than a separation from his head. But Tunstall had never changed and took every opportunity to oppose the reforms.
Tunstall was appalled that Knox was preaching what he considered to be heresy here in his own diocese.
Knox was openly condemning the Mass as idolatry and blasphemy. For Tunstall, the celebration of Mass, the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, was the center of religion.
When Jesus took the bread, he said, "This is my body." When he took the wine, he said, "This is my blood shed for you." Now the question is, what did he mean?
Gradually, through time, some people began to interpret that in a very literal sense. The bread or the wafer and the wine actually became physically the body and the blood of the Lord Jesus Christ.
Every time it takes place, Christ's sacrifice is happening in reality again and again and again.
Tunstall summoned Knox to appear for discipline before the Council of the North. This council ruled half the country in the name of the king. With the council assembled, and with power over Knox's life and liberty in their hands, Tunstall demanded that Knox provide an explanation.
How dost thou answer these charges?
I endeavour to prove that the Mass in her most high degree and most honest garments is an idol, struck from the inventive brain of superstition.
It was very customary for the people in the pew to worship the elements of bread and wine and to treat them as though they were Christ himself. The Reformers strongly objected to that because it's not a biblical teaching.
The purpose of the Eucharist is not for Christ to be physically ingested, but for Christ to be intimately experienced.
The Reformers took the view that these elements of bread and wine were symbols representing his broken body and his shed blood.
And if the bread is really just bread, but if someone calls it God and insists that it is the body of Christ and asks you to bow in adoration, then that, of course, is idolatry.
The Council of the North were very impressed with the force of Knox's arguments. To Tunstall's fury, they even asked him to take on a preaching role here, in the strategic city of Newcastle.
Knox now had a platform for his ideas to be heard all over North England. For the next 2 years, he continued to preach regularly in both Newcastle and Berwick. He could have decided to preach full-time in Newcastle, but there was one reason that he could not bring himself to leave.
Her name was Marjorie.
Marjorie Bowes was the daughter of a landowner in the north of England with whom Knox became acquainted during his time in Berwick.
She's a fifth daughter, so she might have been allowed a bit more freedom to choose who she wants, and she obviously does choose who she wants.
He doesn't seem to have got on at all well with the father, who was very much opposed to his marriage to their daughter Marjorie.
Most people were still not terribly sure about clergy being married, and this is the north of England and a conservative area. Marjorie would probably have had to face a lot of opposition. One person who is not dragging her feet is Marjorie's mother, Elizabeth. She's a huge fan.
There's a considerable number of letters between Knox and Elizabeth Bowes.
None is this day within the realm of England with whom I would more gladly speak. Only she whom God hath commanded me to love as my own flesh accepted, and with thee.
There was definitely a close relationship between Elizabeth and Knox. Highly unlikely that it was sexual, but it was intimate.
The letters, I think, are revealing of Knox as a very human personality.
Unfortunately, Marjorie's letters have not survived. But what we do know is what Marjorie does. She's the one who is prepared to stay by Knox when most of her family don't want her to continue to associate with him.
Knox continued to rise in prominence in the English church, and even had opportunity to preach in London before the king himself. But not everything was to his liking. One thing he saw which particularly offended him was that the people would kneel when celebrating the Lord's Supper. Although this was tradition, Knox saw it as an idolatrous throwback to the pre-Reformation times. Taking the opportunity when invited to preach before the king and Privy Council, Knox launched with typical fervour into a punchy diatribe against the popish practice of kneeling.
The Lord Jesus Christ did not kneel with taking his supper. Indeed, kneeling is nothing but man's imagination, and it is far better to follow the example of Christ than sit.
There's no problem with kneeling at prayer. It demonstrates a humbleness in the sight of God. But where Knox does have a problem is kneeling for communion.
He was always afraid that the superstitions of the Middle Ages would creep back into the Reformed Church.
His concern really was to worship God properly.
The Privy Council were impacted by the force of Knox's spirited arguments, but Knox was too late. The second edition of the prayer book was already going into print, and it explicitly instructed congregations to kneel for the Eucharist.
Cranmer had worked hard to keep the church on a stable course of reform, and he was not pleased when he heard about Knox's protest. He wrote a letter to the Privy Council telling them to stick to the prayer book as it stood.
Well, the Privy Council decided that you couldn't rewrite the prayer book, and so they initiated a clause which came to be known as the Black Rubric.
Rubric's a technical term where something in the main text of the book is actually explained.
The Black Rubric explains that no worship is intended in the kneeling that was required.
And the idea was to keep everybody at least reasonably happy.
Knox wasn't satisfied with the Black Rubric because he thought there shouldn't be kneeling, but it was better than nothing.
The authorities were so impressed by Knox that they asked him to become a bishop, the Bishop of Rochester. Knox, however, refused. He confesses in a letter that he was afraid of what might happen if Mary Tudor became queen. The king was dangerously ill, and Mary, next in line to the throne, was a fervent Catholic. Knox could foresee terrible times ahead for Protestants in England, and if he became a bishop, he would have no honourable choice but to stay and face persecution, or even martyrdom.
As an ordinary preacher, Knox had another option. He could escape to the continent. And when Mary Tudor became queen and a wave of persecution broke out, that is exactly what he did. Leaving Marjorie behind, Knox slipped away from England.
Knox landed on the shores of France a refugee with only 10 groats in his pocket. While before he had enjoyed a comfortable house and an official position, now he had nothing, and he began to feel ashamed of running away. As news arrived from England of his friends being arrested, an idea came to Knox that would define much of his later life.
Powerful ideas arose in Knox's mind, particularly revolution, the right of lawful revolution.
What do you do if your ruler or if the state is trying to enforce idolatry? Or what are the rights of the people in a situation like that?
This was a radical idea, even in an age of radical ideas. And Knox decided to ask the leaders of the Reformation for their counsel.
He travelled widely, meeting the pastors and teachers who were shaping Protestant theology. Most crucially, his wanderings led him here, to Geneva, the Reformation powerhouse of John Calvin.
John Calvin was a 16th century reformer who went to Geneva in Switzerland, and he was the greatest of all the theologians of the Reformation.
And what Calvin's theology is based on is the idea of God's sovereignty.
He also had a marvellous facility in interpreting the Bible, and his Bible commentaries continue in print to this day.
Calvin is able to take control not just of the church in Geneva, but of the whole political setup.
In Geneva, there were many people who resented the strict discipline that Calvin sought to teach.
They have to attend church every Sunday, and they are subject to the control of the consistory, which polices people's ethical behavior.
But nevertheless, the principles that he taught went worldwide, and they have tended to democratize many countries of the world.
This, the Cathedral of San Pierre, is the place where Calvin unrolled his Reformed theology across Europe. And it was here that Knox got Calvin's opinion on his burning question.
Better that we all perish 100 times, said Calvin, than that the name of Christianity and the gospel should come under such disgrace.
Knox looks up to Calvin, very much so. He looks for direction. But Knox is also quite prepared to disagree with Calvin on certain things and not take Calvin's advice.
By this time, Knox had already made up his mind, and not even Calvin could convince him otherwise. If the government should force Catholic religion on its country, the people should resist, with force if necessary.
The state should in no way be allowed to squash the church. Anyone attempting to do that was to be resisted by the people.
Inspired by his new idea, Knox wrote this fiery pamphlet for circulation in England. The Faithful Admonition, he called it, and it condemned the leaders of church and state who were persecuting Protestants and reintroducing Catholicism. His harshest words were saved for Queen Mary Tudor, who he called a modern-day Jezebel, an oath-breaker, and altogether a wicked person.
The pamphlet was viewed from an English perspective as highly seditious, and it led to a very precarious situation for those reformers who remained in England.
It gave the impression that they were in some part involved with a potential revolutionary plot.
Knox went so far as to exclaim, God, for his great mercy's sake,
stir up some Phineas or Jehu, that the blood of abominable idolaters may pacify God's wrath.
As both Phineas and Jehu were Old Testament characters who had famously killed idolaters in the name of God, Knox, in this pamphlet, is making a direct appeal for the assassination of the Queen. Let her fate be like that of Cardinal Beaton, or Jezebel herself.
I don't think Knox said that lightly.
He's seen a hope for reform in England under Edward disappear, and for the pendulum to swing as far back the other way as he could ever fear.
So those who are on the continent are becoming radicalized because they are desperate, because they are seeing their friends, their co-religionists, being executed in large numbers.
Over 300 were burnt to death or various other forms of torture.
And the only thing they can think of is to call for full-scale resistance.
For Knox, assassination in such a situation would actually be a judicial act, simply because the government can't do it, because the government is in the hand of the Queen.
Towards the end of the year, Knox received a call to preach here, in Frankfurt. A group of English exiles had established a church here for the refugees, but they had no minister. And so, as winter drew in, Knox arrived and began to preach again.
The church was newly established and did not feel bound by Anglican traditions, so Knox had some freedom to reform the service. He did not abandon the prayer book, but modified it. The people, of course, did not kneel for the Lord's Supper.
The building used by Knox stood here on Weissfrauenstrasse, but was sadly destroyed during the Second World War. Knox preached here for 4 months before the arrival of another large group of English refugees. They were led by a prominent reformer, Dr. Richard Cox of Oxford University. He was not impressed that they'd abandoned the prayer book, when back in England people were dying in its defence.
This is an English church. It must have an English face.
The only face any church should be that of Jesus.
Cox insisted upon a full congregational vote on whether to use the prayer book. The elders agreed, but said that as Cox and his group had only just joined the church, they should not be allowed to vote. In such a case, the outcome would be clear. Knox, however, intervened. He insisted that the whole congregation should vote, including all the new arrivals. Perhaps it was an attempt to reach out in friendship, but Cox could not forget the harm done by Knox's pamphlet.
Not contented with voting to reinstate the prayer book, the newly enlarged congregation also voted to expel Knox. Disheartened and betrayed, John Knox left Frankfurt and left the Church of England, never to return. Knox had been away from Scotland for 8 years, but now began to receive letters urging him to return. Things were changing back home, and Protestantism was spreading. An array of pamphlets, as well as a large number of catchy songs, had popularised the Reformed cause as never before. However, the opposition was hardening. Mary of Guise had supplanted the Earl of Arran as regent and was determined to quash the movement. But to her irritation, the number of Protestants was growing ever larger and more vocal. The time was right, Knox felt, for a second Protestant assault on Scotland.
Pausing only briefly in Berwick to see Marjorie, Knox wasted no time in entering Scotland and starting to preach. The people heard him gladly, and he had the support and protection of a powerful landowner, John Erskine of Dun.
Erskine would remain one of Knox's most loyal comrades in the coming struggle, and he was keen to see Knox making an impact not just on the peasants, but on the most powerful as well. He arranged a supper at which Knox could meet the newly appointed Secretary of State, William Maitland of Lethington. As these two men met, each sensed in the other a formidable character. Lethington claimed to be sympathetic to Protestantism, but as a high-ranking public official, he had to pay lip service to Catholicism and attend Mass. For Knox, this was unacceptable compromise.
Thou thinkest it lawful for a child of God to prostrate himself before that idol?
Mr. Knox, the Christian faith came from the Jewish and the Protestant from the Church of Rome. As the apostles continued to worship in Jewish synagogues, a Protestant is at liberty to attend Mass.
There is no comparison to be made.
Knox was no doubt disappointed at Lethington's accommodating attitude, but he had to accept that there was a wide variety of belief within the Protestant movement. If Reformation was ever to come to Scotland, Lethington, Knox, and the whole spectrum needed to move as one.
Knox would be on the furthest end of the spectrum possible, that there is no way that the Catholic Church can be restored or redeemed. Only a new start can rectify the situation.
He's trying to push people into separating very clearly from the Roman Catholic Church in Scotland.
Both Catholicism and Protestantism in Scotland today have infected themselves with illiberal kinds of theology that have perhaps blunted them both. The Church herself has lost confidence in her own message.
When people lose their conviction of the truth, you lose Christianity altogether and get something which is not Christianity. So nothing better could happen today than that people should start to read the Bible again.
And I think it's one of the things Knox would identify right away, the need for knowledge and the need for the Word of God to actually just come across, the need for it to be known.
Knox's preaching was now beginning to irritate the Catholic hierarchy. Since the death of Cardinal Beaton, Archbishop Hamilton had become the leader of the Scottish Church. A younger brother of the Earl of Arran, the previous regent, Hamilton had connections at the highest levels. He charged Knox with heresy and summoned him for trial here in the capital city of Edinburgh. Fully expecting to be ignored by the reformer, he was greatly alarmed when Knox decided to answer his summons.
All eyes in Scotland were fixed on Edinburgh as John Knox rode in to stand trial. But he did not come alone. With him were Erskine and many other supporters.
If this man speaketh, your grace, there will be riots in the streets.
This heretic is bold. I may have underestimated him.
Thou shalt withdraw the charges.
I'll find a way, your majesty.
Knox took advantage of his freedom to preach twice a day here on the Royal Mile. As Knox continued preaching, the Earl of Glencairn came to hear him, identifying himself publicly as a Protestant. Glencairn optimistically advised Knox to write directly to Mary of Guise, asking for support in their reforms. Mary passed off his letter as a joke. It is said Knox never forgave her. Knox began to feel that the Reformation had stalled again. Receiving an invitation to be a pastor back in Geneva, Knox abruptly left. This time, Marjorie Bowes went with him. The two were free to marry.
"9 months after arriving in Geneva, they had a son, Nathaniel. There was nowhere better, Knox felt, to settle down and raise a family.
Knox loved his time in Geneva, and I think that was one of the things that made it so difficult to go back to Scotland.
It was a place of peace, a place of learning, a place of Christian fellowship, a place of safety.
Geneva was a fascinating place, and if you're of the Reformed persuasion, it was the place to be. There was no doubt about that.
While in Geneva at this time, Knox wrote this book, the one for which he is most notorious to this day.
The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women. It's a marvellous title that has come down to us, and one can actually say that the title is the most exciting part of that book. It has the basic premise that no woman should rule over a political state.
Who can deny that it is repugnant to nature that the blind lead those who can see, that the impotent should nourish the healthy, that the foolish shall govern the wise? And such be all women that bear authority over men.
There's an element of excess in some of the things that Knox wrote. It would be hard to defend them seriously.
Knox, when he's writing his First Blast, knows precisely where he's aiming, and that is Queen Mary Tudor. But despite the fact that he is attacking women in the sense of no female rule, Knox doesn't hate women at all. He works very well with women.
It would seem that most of his close friends were women, and there's very little evidence of Knox's misogyny.
This is the Auditoire de Calvin, and it was here that Knox preached to the English refugees in Geneva. It continues the tradition to the present day as a Church of Scotland.
However, Knox was not permitted to enjoy the peace of Geneva for long. Back in Scotland, revolution was in the air, and letters were arriving regularly asking Knox to return. But despite Knox's opinions in favour of active resistance to a wicked ruler, when faced with a real revolution, Knox was hesitant.
Is it right to take up arms against those whom God hath appointed to rule the country? Can Christ be cruelly preached by those who are declaring war?
Knox conferred with Calvin, who he knew opposed such revolutions, but received an unexpected reply. Calvin told him that at such a time of turmoil in Scotland, Knox's duty was to be present in his own native land, seeking to influence events for good.
And so Knox set out for a third and final Protestant assault on Scotland, ready to risk everything to bring home the Reformation.
There were more people executed for heresy or Protestant doctrine in the 20, 30 years before 1560 than there had been in the preceding 1,000 years, literally.
I see the battle shall be great. For Satan rageth even to the uttermost, and I am come, I praise my God, even in the brunt of the battle.
As Knox arrived in Scotland on the 2nd of May, 1559, the battle lines were being drawn up. On the one side were the Lords of the Congregation, as the leaders of the revolutionaries called themselves. They were small in number, but they had the quiet support of many ordinary townsfolk and yeomen. Against them stood Mary of Guise, the lawful regent, and Archbishop Hamilton, head of the Scottish clergy. With the full power of church and state behind them, they were more resolved than ever to eradicate Protestantism. All that was needed was for a pebble to move, to start an avalanche that would sweep through the country. The moment came sooner than expected. 4 Protestant preachers were charged with preaching without permission from a bishop. They were summoned here to Stirling Castle for trial, and Knox decided to accompany them. Along with him were Erskine and a great crowd of supporters.
As the numbers grew, Knox decided to halt 30 miles away in Perth. To have led an angry crowd here into the middle of the Queen Regent's camp would have been inviting bloodshed.
Seeing the numbers gathered in support of these preachers, the Queen Regent indicated that all charges would be dropped. But when the day of the trial arrived, the 4 men were outlawed for failing to appear in court. Knox, now the leading preacher in the party, announced the news here in St John's Kirk to the crowd in Perth during a sermon on deceit. Feeling furious and betrayed, that same day a riot broke out in Perth. This church and 2 local monasteries were attacked and ransacked in a violent uprising.
Knox writes later that he, along with the other preachers and magistrates, called on the mob to stop. But there was no stopping the riot, which turned to arson, looting, and wanton destruction.
What Knox allows to happen and what he is inciting is an iconoclastic riot.
People vented their frustration with the Catholic Church by destroying art within church buildings.
Knox felt that many people were actually worshipping the image, the statues or the stained glass or whatever it was.
He viewed these as idolatrous, and idolatry is what was fundamentally a problem with the church.
You're also trying to create a clean or cleansed space so that Protestant worship can take place.
In one way, Knox approved this destruction, in one way. That he wanted the things destroyed, but he didn't approve the way it was done.
It fundamentally wiped away the pre-Reformation religious culture as it was preserved physically, and we were left with the shells of buildings.
The outbreak of violence here in the town of Perth forced Mary's hand. No regent of Scotland could allow such anarchy to remain unchallenged. She rallied her supporters and prepared to march on the town. Meanwhile, in the west, Glencairn had raised an army on the side of the reformers and was rushing to join them. With the storm clouds gathering, one of Mary's most powerful supporters rode quickly from Stirling to Perth to attempt a last desperate effort at diplomacy. The Lord James was the illegitimate son of the old king, and sympathetic to the reformers' cause, if not their methods. At his insistence, and with the promise of tolerance from the Queen Regent, Knox and the reformers left Perth. But Knox wrung from him a vow. If Mary broke her promise of tolerance, Lord James pledged to fully support the reformers in their revolution.
Unaware of this pact, Mary entered Perth and immediately deposed its magistrates and provost.
And what of honour? The terms of our truce lie spat upon this day.
I have no duty to keep faith with heretics.
Lord James and several other prominent nobles took this as their cue to defect and join the Lords of the Congregation. In one day, Mary's victory was turned to defeat.
By now, Knox was back here in St Andrews, preaching again right under the nose of the impotent Archbishop Hamilton. It is said that by his preaching, many in the town were converted to the Protestant faith, including 21 priests. It was now around Knox that the Lords of the Congregation gathered, with an army of some thousands. Not knowing their strength, Mary marched against them in battle. If it was a civil war they wanted, she was more than ready to bring it to them. It was a foggy day as her army lined up on the moors of Fife. When the fog lifted and her generals saw the size of the opposing force, they realised immediately there was no way they could defeat them that day. The Queen Regent was outnumbered and had no choice but to negotiate. Neither the Queen Regent nor the Lords of the Congregation saw much hope for their negotiations, and so were both conducting other secret conversations.
Mary's daughter was now a teenager, recently crowned Queen of France. Mary wrote to her, asking for a French fleet to come and crush the Lords of the Congregation. Meanwhile, the reformers were requesting help from England, now the foremost Protestant power in the region. Seizing their opportunity when Mary was away from the city, the Lords of the Congregation marched into Edinburgh and took control. John Knox was with them, and to him fell the task of attempting to reform the capital. The Church of St Giles in Edinburgh has been one of the foremost churches in Scotland ever since it was built in the 12th century.
It was to here that Knox was now called to preach, and he relished the opportunity to have for the first time his own church in his own country.
He preached regularly to large congregations, reminding them that the revolution, first and foremost, concerned the truth of God.
It is evident that neither election of people nor force of arms maketh a distinction betwixt superior and inferior powers, but only the perfect ordinance of God.
He sees himself as having a responsibility to arouse people to action in support of Scripture truth.
He believes the Holy Spirit speaks through him, but he does a lot of his homework and he knows how he's going to develop his sermon.
Just the sheer power of his oratory, I think, was quite unusual.
Sometimes he's a bit shocked himself at the effect of his words, but he is quite clear that it is his duty as a preacher and a prophet to say things very precisely and to apply Scripture to the present situation.
The church is more priestly than prophetic today. The number of men who will stand up in the name of God and actually speak confidently from an authoritative Bible to the needs of the day are really rare.
Maitland of Lethington was still the secretary of the Queen Regent.
He was aware of all the secret negotiations and knew everything that Mary was planning. But Mary's trust in Lethington was entirely misplaced. He was an agent of the reformers and was passing on to them a frequent flow of information, biding his time before declaring himself openly. Getting word that Mary was on the move, the Lords of the Congregation rode out to meet her, but now it was their turn to be outnumbered. She forced them to sign a treaty here in Leith. The capital would be hers once again. Although Knox wanted to remain in St Giles, preaching in defiance of the Queen Regent, it was simply too dangerous, and he grudgingly agreed to leave. But his disappointment was turned to delight when he was reunited with his wife Marjorie, who had at last managed to follow him from Geneva with their 2 young boys.
Meanwhile, support was growing for the reformers, and they had been boosted by the defection of several key noblemen. However, there was still no sign of the English. So with the Queen Regent fortifying Leith and French troops regularly arriving, the lords of the congregation gathered in Stirling to come up with a plan.
These men decided to appoint themselves, rather spuriously, as the Privy Council. Although Mary of Guise was the Queen Regent, it was her teenage daughter who technically held the throne. As the only legitimate child of the previous king, the young Mary Queen of France was also Mary Queen of Scots.
So, in her name, the lords of the congregation deposed Mary of Guise from the regency. This proclamation, at once so petty and so momentous, was the spark the lords needed. They marched on Edinburgh, but Mary had quietly withdrawn to her stronghold in Leith.
As the lords of the congregation marched again into Edinburgh, Lethington saw his opportunity and defected. His betrayal hurt Mary deeply. But the Protestant party welcomed him with open arms. Knox alone seemed less than enthusiastic, seeing in Lethington someone more interested in political revolution than Christian reformation. Despite Knox's sermons and Lethington's policies, morale was weakening and soldiers were deserting. The Reformation, such as it was, suddenly looked incredibly fragile, and Mary incredibly strong. One night, on the 5th of November, something seemed to snap, and the lords of the congregation quickly retreated from Edinburgh, pelted with stones by the laughing citizens. As Mary's armies occupied the city, Knox too had to escape for his life. Here in Holyrood Church, Stirling, John Knox preached to the lords of the congregation. Defeat, he said, was not a divine punishment for rebellion. It was a reminder to repent and renew faith in God, whose truth they were upholding. The truth and the gospel may be suppressed for a time, but they will eventually and inevitably
overcome. Yea, whatsoever becometh of us and our mortal carcasses, I doubt not that this cause, in despite of Satan, shall prevail in the realms of Scotland. For it is the eternal truth of the eternal God, so it shall at once prevail.
He's not a general, he's not a commander, but he does hold those troops together, and he calls upon their religious zeal. If you're fighting for the cause of Christ, under the banners of Christ, you will win in the end.
He lifted their eyes up above the immediate setbacks that they had received to the advancing of the kingdom of Christ, from which their true strength came.
It was a God-given thing, we believe, the sheer ability of Knox just to turn the morale of a people by preaching the word. There was a power unleashed in Scotland at the Reformation.
Many people were being converted in Scotland, and that was what was moving the Reformation forward.
It was a hard winter for the reformers. Knox himself was almost captured by French troops as he tried again to preach in St Andrews. But spring saw the arrival of the English, and the balance changed once more. After some strategic victories, the rebels had pushed forward, and Mary of Guise had taken refuge in Edinburgh Castle. She would never leave it again. Contracting a debilitating illness, she was left bedridden and worsening by the week. By the middle of June, she was dead.
The death of Mary changed everything, and within a month a treaty had been agreed. All French and English troops would leave Scotland, and the Scottish Parliament would convene to direct the country. The treaty was met with delight across Scotland.
The Scottish Parliament met in 1560 with more powers than it had enjoyed for generations. A key priority was to establish a new national Reformed church to replace the Catholic Church in Scotland. It was at once decreed that Catholicism should be banned outright, and that those attending Mass, after 2 warnings, should be executed. It might seem strange that there were not then hundreds of devout Catholics lining up ready to be killed for their faith, but by this stage, the Scottish Catholic Church was so degenerate that nobody could be found who was willing to die for the old church. Christian faithfulness was held in monopoly by the reformers.
But what was needed was more than enthusiasm. A visible unity was required, around which the array of Protestant preachers and congregations could unite. John Knox and 5 other men, all in a rather odd coincidence also called John, were appointed to write the Confession, or Statement of Faith, upon which the new Church of Scotland could be founded. These men met to hammer out a document that would become known as the Scots Confession.
Reformed theologians have said that the Scots Confession is a very clear and concise declaration of what the Reformed Church would believe.
Of course, it's in Scots dialect, but easy enough to read for the English reader.
It's not really as anti-Roman Catholic as some Protestants would like it to have been.
Uniquely, I think, these 6 men speak about Christ as our brother in a very touching and beautiful way, dying for them, rising again, ascending up on high, and waiting to welcome them to heaven.
It's much more of the flavour of a manifesto than many of the other confessions. It's got the flavour of war bound up with it.
This is the confession that Knox and the others wrote as the basis for the national church. It was approved by Parliament with a huge majority and became the statement of faith for the Church of Scotland for 100 years.
But from theology, Knox had to move on to practicalities. How would the church operate? Would it start with the existing Catholic Church and seek to reform it, as Cranmer had done in England? Or would it reject the existing church entirely and start again?
Knox wants the church to be independent and autonomous of the state.
But they had this clear perception that they wanted to use the power of the state to support Protestant Reformation in Scotland.
As soon as the nobles realised that the new church was going to need their cash, their enthusiasm abruptly disappeared. Undeterred, Knox and his comrades began the work of forming the Church of Scotland.
If you were walking into your parish church in 1560, you would see things that are different, mainly those things that have gone.
The services were simpler, most of the ceremony was gone, and there was great emphasis on the preaching of the word.
What you hear is different. Everything is in the vernacular, in English or Scots, or, of course, in the Gaelic-speaking areas, in Gaelic.
By and large, before the Reformation, the people watched and listened to the worship. After the Reformation, increasingly, the people participated.
The congregation has to do things it never had to do before. For example, it has to sing. It sings psalms, which becomes absolutely central to the Scottish Reformed tradition.
The concern is that the people be taught, that they should understand what they're doing, they should understand the scriptures, they should understand the teaching of scripture.
It was Knox's wish that there should be a church and a school in every parish in Scotland.
Knox was very committed to this aspect of reforming social life.
One of the problems in the Middle Ages was that people were not educated to read the Bible, and therefore they couldn't judge for themselves whether the religion they were hearing was right or wrong. So education was the solution to this.
The genius of Presbyterianism was that power was shared around, and that along with the minister there were elders and there was a hierarchy of church courts.
Decisions are made nationally by a General Assembly, but that assembly is representative of all of the layers below it because representation moves upwards.
Rather than everything being done by people higher up and these people supervising and what have you, the church was suddenly for everybody.
But regardless of the numbers coming to hear him, Knox could see the tide was on the turn. The infant church was vulnerable, and the government support fragile. Meanwhile, the nobles were already beginning to turn against each other, looking for their own profit.
How long can it be before everything that hath been accomplished doth fall apart once more, and Scotland end in a worse state than ever was?
Knox was not the only one concerned about the country. Scotland was still without a ruling king or queen, and Lethington knew that something had to be done to ensure stability.
In winter, he made his decision. Francis II of France had suddenly died, leaving Mary, the teenage daughter of Mary of Guise and nominal Queen of Scots, as a young widow. As Queen of France, she could never have ruled Scotland. As a once more single woman, the prospects were much more promising. Lethington took the matter to Parliament. Knox, suspicious of the young Mary from the start, might have been expected to argue against Lethington's proposal. But Knox was not thinking about politics. That winter, his own beloved Marjorie had taken ill and died, leaving him with his two infant sons, Nathaniel and Eleazar.
I am the rising again and the life. Each that believeth in me shall not die without end.
While Knox was still in mourning, the Parliament decided to invite Mary formally to return to Scotland. Mary was a Catholic, like her mother before her, and there were some who feared she may be a rallying point for the old religion. But they were unable to convince the Parliament, so in autumn, Mary, Queen of Scots, was welcomed into Edinburgh by cheering crowds.
She was an attractive character. She was an interesting woman and in some respects, a good queen and a wise queen with a tragic life.
The first Sunday Mary was in Scotland, she had Mass celebrated here in Holyrood House. Despite this offence being made punishable by death, special exemption was made for her, and her half-brother Lord James guarded the chapel door himself. Knowing the influence Knox had on the people, Mary summoned him for an interview. The two had much in common. Both were recently bereaved. Both had been in the public gaze for years, and both were outspoken, direct, and passionate people. Their confrontations have gone down in history.
Knox himself wrote about the interviews he had with Mary, Queen of Scots, and it's one of the most compelling dialogues that you could read.
Mary was curious about this notorious man and the religion he preached. But when she indicated that the Roman Church was the true church, Knox took her to task. Neither her choice nor her belief could alter the truth. She only believed these things because she had been taught by Catholics all her life.
Thou dost interpret the scriptures in one manner and they in another. Whom then shall I believe?
Thou shalt believe God, madam, that plainly speaketh in his word.
Knox had been the pastor of two very important congregations in Frankfurt and then in Geneva, and nobody in Scotland has that sort of experience. And that explains really why he was able to go to Holyrood Palace and argue with absolute fearlessness with Mary, Queen of Scots, who technically had the right to have him taken out and executed.
But unable to hold back, Knox went further. He declared the Pope was the Antichrist, the Church of Rome a harlot, and Mary he compared to the tyrannical Emperor Nero. Lethington, recording the incident in a letter, was more impressed with Mary than with Knox. He praised her composure and wisdom, and noted that Paul, in the Bible, did not start his appeal to the Roman governors Felix and Festus by coarsely abusing their gods.
He has constructed a sort of composite character made up of all the Queen Marys he has known. Queen Mary Tudor, Mary of Guise, and Mary Queen of Scots. And he dehumanizes all three individuals and creates this Queen Mary stock character in his mind. She's a Catholic, therefore she must be a persecuting Catholic. And he cannot see beyond that.
Some historians say that had Knox been warmer or gentler toward Mary, he may have won her heart rather than simply winning the argument. A few suggest that Mary could even have converted to Protestantism. But Knox was dreadfully afraid of Mary's power and influence. He cared more for Scotland than for his own life, and would rather risk royal displeasure than see Scotland succumb to superstition.
He did actually feel, for example, that if she was allowed to have Mass said for herself at Holyrood, that was liable to be the death blow of the Reformation.
The relationship between Knox and Mary took an unexpected twist when Knox married again. His second wife was Margaret Stuart, a distant relative of the Queen, and only 17 years old, 30 years younger than Knox.
It would be regarded today as highly unusual. Probably various pejorative terms would be applied to it. But at the time, it was nothing unusual.
It's still quite an age gap, but what causes the scandal is not particularly her age, it's who she is and what her family connections are. She has royal blood in her veins.
Mary was indignant. How could this low-born preacher dare to marry her own cousin?
She suddenly finds at a very, very distant remove, Knox is kin to her, and that probably isn't great. She, however, is not perhaps the best judge of a marriage.
About a year later, Mary decided to marry Lord Darnley, a handsome aristocrat described by a French cardinal as a girlish nincompoop. It was not long before Darnley became jealous of Mary's private secretary, the Italian Catholic David Rizzio. Darnley had him dragged from her chambers and murdered.
As someone who had often called for the death of Catholics, Knox was suspected of conspiring in the murder, and the Queen was in a mood for vengeance. Knox now decided it was too risky to remain in Edinburgh, so he escaped to this remote spot, the district of Kyle in the middle of Ayrshire.
Here he was able to keep a fairly low profile during the turbulence of the next 2 years, as he wrote his own History of the Reformation.
It pleased God in his great mercy in the year 1527 to raise up his servant Master Patrick Hamilton, with whom our history doth begin.
Meanwhile, chaos ruled in Scotland. Darnley was strangled and his house blown up around him.
Straight away, Mary got married again, to the chief suspect in the murder. This time she had gone too far, and she was forced to abdicate in favour of her 1-year-old son. The Lord James now took over as regent, and Knox preached at the coronation service of the infant king.
But things were not all at peace in the land. Mary still had many supporters, and having escaped to England, she was still close at hand to retake her throne. Several nobles and clans pledged their support to the exiled queen, and various castles also declared themselves for her, including the strongest of all, Edinburgh Castle.
With the castle held for the Queen, but the city held for the infant king, the capital was in a state of Cold War.
With the assassination of Lord James, the country was again rocked with a further wave of anarchy. The clans and noble families began to divide in against themselves, and law and order began to break down. Old alliances started to crumble, and every stranger could be a killer.
Meanwhile, Knox continued to preach at St Giles, but it was noted that since the abdication of Mary, Knox seemed diminished, older and weaker. While she had had the throne, these two titans had clashed repeatedly as Scotland looked on. Now that his opponent was gone, Knox seemed to lose some of his previous fire. A stroke further reduced the reformer's speech, energy and mobility. However, his mind remained as active as ever as he continued his work as preacher and pastor.
Knox, even in his very, very busy political days, takes time to correspond with individuals and serves that pastoral role.
His letters show quite a warm, compassionate and caring man. I suppose it's the public persona that's really a problem.
Knox is a ferocious character in terms of his public presence.
He was very strong against what he thought was dangerous and evil.
He also saw in the bigger picture that there was an emphatic decree from God that Scotland needed to be reformed, and that he had a central role in bringing this to fruition.
The reason why he spoke so bluntly was the souls of immortal people had to be protected from the danger of false religion.
When a musket ball was fired into Knox's window, narrowly missing the old reformer, Knox decided to leave Edinburgh, expecting never to return. Accompanied by his family and secretary, John Knox returned here, to St Andrews. It was a long journey for a man now so frail, and it took him several weeks. But he spent the last summer of his life here, where it had all begun, 25 years ago. Despite the continued unrest in the country, St Andrews was a haven of peace for Knox. He made it his habit to sit in the college gardens and talk to the students, particularly those studying divinity. Study hard, he encouraged them.
Know God. Be faithful. Bless Scotland.
The unrest was quelled in early autumn, and a new truce agreed.
In this new peace, Knox was able to return to Edinburgh. But his strength was failing, and on November the 9th, 1572, he preached at the induction service of his replacement in St Giles. It was to be his last sermon.
I testify this day that I have faithfully preached among you the eternal word of God, and now I pray it were not in vain.
The very next day he fell ill, and within a fortnight he was dead.
Dear Meg, read me again that passage where first I cast my anchor.
These things Jesus spake, and when he had cast up his eyes into heaven, he said, Father, the hour cometh. Glorify thy Son, that thy Son glorify thee.
It was reported by his secretary that Knox's last words, after praying for some time, were, "Now it has come."
Then, without movement or sign of any pain, Knox seemed rather to fall asleep than to die. Knox greeted his death without fear, knowing that the one who had died on the cross centuries before had died for him. Death held no more sting. For Knox, it was only a door to everlasting glory.
He dies not knowing whether it's all going to be okay from his perspective. In fact, he dies believing it's not.
He thought the Reformation had failed when he died.
He really wanted to see a nation that was covenanted before God and knew its doctrinal basis and was strong and vigorous. And just for a short window, Scotland got there.
Knox's grave is one of the humblest in Scotland. Here, in a city centre car park, lies the man described as one of the greatest men our country has ever produced.
From today's perspective, Knox can be seen to be intransigent, totally anti-Catholic.
Dominating, domineering, a single-minded, authoritarian figure.
You do wonder how easy it would be sometimes maybe to get along with him at a certain level.
On the personal level, yes, he can be a very difficult man.
His failures were undoubtedly there, and there were rough edges to his character, but his ideals and aspirations were so great in education, in society, and the church. You must look at the last 400 years and say that he wrought a mighty work under the hand of God.
He brought the gospel to Scotland with such profound influence that the leaders of the nation embraced it as the religion of Scotland.
Scotland becomes a Protestant country. That is a huge difference. It changes not just Scotland, it changes the English-speaking world.
Missionaries went out in considerable numbers from Scotland, and they set up churches in India and Africa. And today these churches are far stronger in these other countries than they are in the homeland.
Actually, you have more missionaries coming from the majority world to Western Europe and America than the other way around.
500 years on, Knox would probably barely recognise his own country. Not only have things changed outwardly, but the spirit of Scotland has changed too. The fear of God, which marked the country of Knox's day, both in Catholic and Protestant circles, has been replaced by disinterest and polite ridicule. Even in the church, apathy reigns and godliness is a joke.
The Scottish nation seems to be wanting to shake off almost its last vestige of Christian heritage and be proudly and aggressively secular.
I think Christians in Scotland are struggling because of the lack of unity and the lack of a coherent purpose.
I think weakness is a word that immediately springs to mind in describing the 21st century church in Scotland.
We lack power in our preaching. In Knox's time, people were profoundly influenced by preaching. Today, people are fast asleep. They do not realize the shortness of life. They do not realize eternity means heaven or hell.
You feel you're standing against a tsunami of unbelief and of secularism. I think Scotland is in a terribly poor condition spiritually.
With the situation looking increasingly desperate, a new question is taking shape in homes and churches.
Perhaps it is time for a new Reformation in Scotland.
I think if you're to stand with a consciousness of history and look at where we are today, you would only conclude that the nation needs a Reformation/revival.
I think Western Europe is likely to cease to exist in the way that we know it unless there's a revival of true religion.
I have been a minister for 40 years, and I believe the one and only solution for our problems in Scotland is that the Holy Spirit should be poured out afresh upon us to raise up eminent preachers such as Knox and his brethren were.
It would shake people to rethink themselves, their lives, their family structure.
It will happen in some form or another. It's not just a dream, a new Reformation.
It begins with the individual. Knox would have said that too. It begins with the individual, catching the vision for it and catching the fire yourself from God. And that's contagious.
Although much has changed since Knox's day, some things are still the same. God is still real, the Bible is still true, and Knox's challenge still stands.
Know God, be faithful, bless Scotland.